talk about the use of nuclear weapons is always a heated issue because, given what's at stake, using an absolute weapon like that. Now, obviously, whenever you discuss something like that, what must always be brought up is the one and only time they've been used, and that was against Japan around the end of World War II. Now, some information has come out that suggests that it may not have actually been the nuclear weapons dropped by the United States that forced Japan to surrender. That's commonly believed that it was the use of nuclear weapons that convinced Japan to go with the surrender. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the decades about whether or not it was actually necessary to use those bombs. And there's a lot of talk that it wasn't necessary and it was just viciously cruel. It was completely unnecessary. Now, some historians have gone back and looked at some of the documentation that's become available from the government of Japan at the time, and it does reveal a really interesting possibility that Japan may not have surrendered because of the nuclear weapons, but because of Stalin. One thing to keep in mind is that the atomic bombs were dropped 3 days apart, and that if they were not ready to surrender after the first one, then certainly after the second one they were. However, new information shows that this traditional narrative, this view of those events, may not be entirely accurate and may actually portray the opposite. We do know for a fact that after the first bomb was dropped, the Supreme Council met to discuss surrender for the very first time, which means before that, they had not previously discussed the possibility of surrendering. So this would leave a lot of people to believe that it was actually the nuclear bombing that gave them the desire to actually do it. Some of the new information that's come out shows that the Japanese leadership was not actually shook by the atomic bombs at all. And in fact, the devastation caused by these bombs was relatively consistent with what happened with the fire bombings that had been going on for several months, probably around 6 months. In fact, this devastation may not have been all that bad compared to what had been going on over the long term. Meaning, while those were bad events, when you compare it to what had been going on for months, it was relatively equivalent, and that the Japanese leadership didn't really care that people were suffering under it. In fact, they felt like they could actually keep fighting even though those two bombs had been dropped. According to them, what may have been the deal breaker that made them give up was the possibility of the Soviet Union entering into a direct conflict with Japan, in other words, Soviet forces reaching the Japanese mainland. Even the most hardline leaders in Japan's government knew the war could not go on. The question was not whether to continue, but how to bring the war to a close under the best terms possible. The Allies, the United States, Great Britain and others, the Soviet Union, remember, was still neutral, were demanding unconditional surrender. Japan's leaders hoped that they might be able to figure out a way to avoid war crimes trials and keep their form of government, and keep some of the territories they'd conquered, Korea, Vietnam, Burma, parts of Malaysia and Indonesia, a large portion of eastern China, and numerous islands in the Pacific. They had two plans for getting better surrender terms. They had, in other words, two strategic options. The first was diplomatic. Japan had signed a 5-year neutrality pact with the Soviets in April of 1941, which would expire in 1946. A group consisting mostly of civilian leaders and led by Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori hoped that Stalin might be convinced to mediate a settlement between the United States and its allies on the one hand and Japan on the other. Even though this plan was a long shot, it reflected sound strategic thinking. After all, it would be the Soviet Union's interest to make sure that the terms of the settlement were not too favorable for the United States. Any increase in U.S. influence and power in Asia would mean a decrease in Russian power and influence. The second plan was military, and most of its proponents, led by the Army Minister Anami Korochika, were military men. They hoped to use Imperial Army ground troops to inflict high casualties on U.S. forces when they invaded. If they succeeded, they felt they might be able to get the United States to offer better terms. This strategy was also a long shot. The United States seemed deeply committed to unconditional surrender. But since there was, in fact, concern in U.S. military circles that the casualties in an invasion would be prohibitive, the Japanese high command strategy was not entirely off the mark. What this shows is that even after the bombing, Japan felt that they could still fight on. Now, what they wanted to do, what seemed like was the plan, to try to get Stalin to mediate a surrender agreement between the United States and the rest of the Allies and Japan. Most of Japan's forces were stationed along the beach islands, waiting for the main invasion. They weren't actually hit by the nuclear bombs, meaning they were still ready and eager to go. In fact, a lot of them were really, really angry that they had been nuked and were now more than ready to go. It seems like Japan was not cowed too much by the atomic bomb, and that the original plan had been to bring Stalin in as a mediator to get better terms for surrender for Japan, because they knew they were going to lose anyway. The point was to use the Soviets and their interests to try to get better terms for themselves. Unfortunately for them, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, cutting off that possibility. No longer could the Soviet Union be neutral if they were actually invading. Now, when they went in, the Japanese troops, the Kuomintang troops, were spent, they were drained, they really couldn't fight anymore. The 16th Soviet Army Group, with 100,000 men, entered Manchuria and other areas. They went in and they drove and drove in until they actually ran out of fuel and couldn't go any further. The possibility of having Stalin as a broker of a deal between the rest of the Allies and Japan was now officially gone, because Stalin was now no longer a neutral party. The plan after this for the Soviets was to invade Hokkaido. Now, Japan could have possibly fought off one power, the United States, but not both. Not both the US and the Soviet Union. This would prove to be too much for the Japanese defenses. It was Stalin's invasion that put an end to the possibility of Japan holding out against the United States. The Soviet declaration of war also changed the calculation of how much time was left to maneuver. Japanese intelligence was predicting that US forces might not invade for months. Soviet forces, on the other hand, could be in Japan proper in as little as 10 days. The Soviet invasion made a decision on ending the war extremely time sensitive, and Japan's leaders had reached this conclusion some months earlier. In a meeting of the Supreme Council in June 1945, they said that Soviet entry into the war would determine the fate of the empire. Army Deputy Chief of Staff Kwabe said in that same meeting, "The absolute maintenance of peace in our relations with the Soviet Union is imperative for the continuation of the war." Thus, in the end, it was not the atomic bombs of the United States that forced Japan to surrender. It was actually the invasion of Manchuria by Stalin and the eventual plan afterwards to invade Hokkaido. Japan could have held out against the United States, possibly brokering a better deal through the use of Stalin, but that was now impossible now that the Soviet Union had dropped the neutrality and gone full force into Manchuria. The atomic bomb wasn't enough to make Japan quit. In fact, they displayed that they could have continued even with those bombs, and even several more of them. The eventual loss of Japan is attributable to Stalin, not the United States. Now, obviously, there is a lot more information than I've given here in this brief video. I highly recommend that you go to the link in the description, see the actual writing that has a lot more than I've included here, and actually makes the argument that surrender was due to Stalin's actions much stronger. There's much more information there than I've given here in this video, and I highly recommend that you go in, click it, read it, learn about it, and recognize some more about the military genius of Stalin. Thank you for watching. Go ahead, rate, comment, subscribe, share on various social media, and if you want, there's some other great content here you could check out.